Chapter 6. The deep green pool of the Salamis River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gallipan Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool, among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed and the little snake, while its tail waved frantically. Oh. A far rush of wind sounded, and the gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up the silver sides, the brown dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet, and row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Suddenly, Lenny appeared out of the brush. He came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off downriver. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skirted over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up, and he strained toward the sound with his eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head and drank again. When he was finished, he sat down on the bank, with his side to the pool so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed on out of the valley, as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, "I didn't forget. You bet. Hide in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George gonna give me hell," he said. "George gonna wish he was alone and didn't have me bothering him." He turned his head and looked at the bright mountain tops. "I can go right off there and find a cave," he said, and he continued sadly, "and never have no ketchup, but I won't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away." And then, from out of Lenny's head, there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bullseye glasses and wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. "I told you, and I told you," she said. "I told you, mind George, because he's such a nice good fella, and he's good to you. And you don't ever take no care. You do bad things." And Lenny answered her, "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried. I couldn't help it." "You never give a thought to George," she went on in Lenny's voice. "He been doing nice things for you all the time. When he got a piece of pie, he always gave you half, or more than half. And if there was any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you." "I know," said Lenny miserably. "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am." "I tried and tried," she interrupted him. "All the time. He could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and raised hell in a whorehouse. And he could have sat in a pool room and played snooker, but he had to take care of you." Lenny moaned with grief. "I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I'll go right off in the hills, and I'll find a cave, and I'll live there so I won't be no trouble to George." "You just say that," she said sharply. "You're always saying that. And you know, well, you're just never going to do it. You'll just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time." Lenny said, "Might as well just go away. George ain't going to let me tend no rabbits now." Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on his haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears and crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice, too. "Tend rabbits," it said scornfully. "You crazy guy. You ain't fit to lick the boots off no rabbit. You'd forget 'em and let 'em go hungry. That's what you'd do. And then what would George think?" "I would not forget," said Lenny loudly. "Yeah, you wouldn't," said the rabbit. "You ain't worth the greased jackpin to ram you into hell. George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it don't do no good. If you think George is going to let you tend rabbits, you're crazier than usual. He ain't. He's going to bear hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's going to do." Now Lenny retorted belligerently. He ain't neither. George won't do nothing like that. I knew George since, I forgot when, and he ain't never raised his hand to hit me with a stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean. Well, he's sick of you, said the rabbit. He's gonna beat the heck out of you, and then go away and leave you. He won't, cried Lenny frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travel together. But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, He's gonna leave you, you crazy guy. He's gonna leave you alone. He's gonna leave you, you crazy guy. Lenny put his hands over his ears. He ain't. I tell you, he ain't, he cried. Oh, George, George, George. George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. George said quietly, What the hell are you yelling about? Lenny got onto his knees. You ain't gonna leave me here, are you, George? I know you ain't. George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. No. I knowed it, Lenny cried. You ain't that kind. George was silent. Lenny said, George? Yeah? I done another bad thing. It don't make no difference, George said, and he fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft. From the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another. George turned his head and listened to the shouts. Lenny said, George? Yeah? Ain't you gonna give me hell? Give you hell? Sure, like you always done before. Like, if I didn't have you, I'd take my $50. Goodness, Lenny, you can't remember nothing that happened, but you remember every word I say. Well, ain't you gonna say it? George shook himself. He said woodenly, If I was alone, I could live so easy. His voice was monotonous, had no emphasis. I could get a job and have no mess. He stopped. Go on, said Lenny. And when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go to a cat house. He stopped again. Lenny looked eagerly at him. Go on, George. Ain't you gonna give me no more hell? No, said George. Well, I can't go away, said Lenny. I'll go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me. George shook himself again. No, he said, I want you to stay here, with me. Lenny said craftily, Tell me like you done before. Tell you what? About the other guys and about us. George said, Guys like us got no family. They make a little stake and then they blow it. They ain't got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in hell about them. But not us, Lenny cried happily. Tell about us now. George was quiet for a moment. But not us, he said. Because I got you. And I got you. We got each other. That's what gives us the hoot in the hell about us, Lenny cried in triumph. A little evening breeze flew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled, and the wind waves flowed up the green pool. And the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before.